In the summer of 1834, the humid air clung to the thick woods of Virginia like a second skin. Travelers avoided the stretch of land that ran through the hollow near Dry Creek, where an aging plantation house sat veiled by twisted oaks and a lingering scent of rot. Locals called it Black Hollow House, though its true name was forgotten to time, smothered by rumors and cautionary whispers. It was a place few spoke of openly, and fewer still dared approach. The land was owned by the Sullivan family, more precisely, by Reverend Alistair Sullivan, a man of towering presence and chilling silence. Though he hadn't attended church services in over a decade, he still wore the collar, and the townsfolk still called him Reverend, mostly out of fear. He was rarely seen in town, and when he was, he never lingered. He'd walk with a fixed gaze, shoulders square, offering no greetings and receiving none. Behind him always trailed his pale wife, Marguerite, a wisp of a woman with sunken eyes and the shiver of someone who never felt warmth. No one had seen her smile, not even once. The town of Millfield was only 5 miles east, yet the Sullivans lived like they were in a world of their own, isolated, hidden behind ivy-draped gates, and silence thick enough to suffocate. Their house, a once grand 2-story Georgian relic, had grown decrepit with time. Windows remained boarded, lanterns never lit. Some claimed they heard strange sounds at night, echoes of voices not quite human. Others swore they'd seen children running through the misty woods near the estate, only to vanish when called out to. But these were just tales, the kind you'd hear whispered by firelight or traded in hushed tones after church services. At least they were until Marshal Thomas Greaves came to town. A veteran of the War of 1812, Marshal Greaves was a man driven by rules and reason. He'd been sent from Richmond to investigate the increasing reports of missing children from neighboring counties, reports that had been piling up for nearly 5 years, and finally gained the attention of state officials. The pattern was unmistakable. Poor families, migrant laborers, orphaned kin, children who wouldn't be missed by society's elite. The authorities had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to transient disappearances. But by 1833, the number of vanished children reached into the dozens, too many to ignore. Greaves arrived in Millfield with 2 deputies and a thick folder of names, ages, and last known locations. His presence unsettled the townsfolk, not because they had anything to hide, but because they knew something was wrong and had chosen, perhaps unconsciously, to pretend otherwise. Fear had grown like mold here, quiet and unseen. The marshal questioned. Townspeople for days, shopkeepers, pastors, school teachers. He quickly realized that no one would say anything directly, but their avoidance of a particular topic, the Sullivans, was louder than words. When he mentioned the Black Hollow House, the conversation always shifted, eyes dropped, jaws tightened. He noted the sudden unease in their posture, as if they were terrified the very house might hear them speaking. Finally, a break came from a woman named Clara Hensley, the widow who ran Millfield's bakery. She didn't come to the marshal openly. Instead, she left a note under his door in the dead of night. It read, "You won't find what you're looking for above the ground. Go where the cries come from. Follow the river, then the lilies." It was cryptic, but it was something. The next morning, Greaves left the town on foot, alone, heading west toward Dry Creek. As he moved through the woods, he kept his hand on the hilt of his sidearm. The trees leaned in like they were listening. After several hours, he reached the clearing where the Sullivan estate stood. It looked even worse than described, shutters rotting, paint flaking like dead skin. The air, around it thick with mildew and silence. What struck him most was the absolute stillness. Not even birds dared to sing. He didn't knock. The front door creaked open with the push of his gloved hand, revealing a long hall covered in dust and cobwebs. The air inside was heavier, layered with the unmistakable scent of decay masked poorly by herbs. Something had been burned recently, something that did not smell like wood. The house felt abandoned, but signs of life lingered. Plates with crusted food on the dining table, a kettle cooling on the stove, a child's shoe near the staircase. Greaves moved cautiously, methodically clearing each room with his pistol raised. He found nothing but emptiness and dread until he reached the far end of the main hallway where a large armoire had been oddly placed against the wall. He examined it and found scuff marks on the floor, scratches that suggested it had been moved often. Sliding it aside, he discovered what he suspected, a door hidden behind it. It was bolted shut with iron reinforcements and a chain lock, but the scent coming from behind it was unmistakable. Urine, sweat, and blood. He called out, "Is anyone there?" No response. He struck the door 3 times with the butt of his revolver. On the third, he heard it, a faint noise, not unlike a gasp or sob. Then another, then a chorus of whimpers, soft but chilling. He shouted again, "I'm Marshal Greaves! I'm here to help!" The sobs grew louder. He heard shuffling, scratching, then one word, so faint he barely heard it. "Help!" Greaves wasted no time. He returned to his horse, fetched his tools, and pried the door open with the help of a crowbar and hammer. It took over half an hour. When the door finally gave way, the smell hit him like a fist. Inside was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Lantern raised, he descended. What he found in that basement would haunt him until his dying breath. Dozens of children, emaciated, filthy, bruised, chained by their ankles to rusted iron rings embedded in the walls. Their eyes were wide with fear and disbelief, and none of them spoke above a whisper. Some were as young as 5. The oldest couldn't have been more than 15. They had been living there, if it could be called living, for years. And above them, unnoticed for all that time, the house of God-fearing Reverend Sullivan had carried on in eerie silence. But this discovery was only the beginning, because as Marshal Greaves stepped deeper into that horrific chamber, he saw something worse. Drawings on the walls, written, in charcoal and something darker. Symbols, names, rituals. And in one corner a book bound in strange hide and inked in something not red, but black. The whispers of the house had only begun to speak. Marshal Thomas Greaves stood still at the bottom of the stairs, his lantern flickering in protest against the suffocating dark. The basement beneath the Sullivan home was vast, far larger than the foundation of the house would suggest. The space had been carved deeper than any normal cellar, as if hollowed out slowly and deliberately over years. The walls wept moisture. The floor was packed dirt, thick with old blood and stains beyond recognition. And in the far corner of the chamber, past the trembling, silent children, past the rusted chains and stained rags, was a pedestal. Upon it sat a book, its cover mottled with time and damp, its pages swollen but preserved. It wasn't like any religious text Greaves had ever seen, and he had studied many. This was something else. It emanated cold. The light from his lantern seemed to pull away from the object as though repelled. When he approached it, the air grew heavier, pressing against his chest. The title wasn't in English, at least not any English he recognized. The letters were curved and sharp at once, an alphabet he could not place, arranged in a circular, ritualistic script. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled a handkerchief from his coat and picked up the book delicately. It was heavier than it looked. Behind him, one of the children gave a startled whimper. He turned, his lantern casting a long, shivering shadow behind him. "It's all right," he said gently. "I'm taking you all out of here." But none of them moved. They looked to one another as if uncertain. Their eyes weren't full of relief. They were full of dread. One girl, perhaps 10, whispered with cracked lips, "You shouldn't touch it." Greaves knelt down beside her. "What is this book? Did someone read from it?" Her eyes drifted toward the far wall, where markings had been carved deeply into the stone. Circles, figures, diagrams, not unlike alchemical illustrations. Beneath them, in a child's desperate hand, words were scratched in English. "Don't say the names out loud." Greaves swallowed hard and stood. The children, 47 of them, were far too weak to walk on their own. He returned to Millfield, rallying the town doctor and 3 of his strongest men. Together they brought carts and blankets. For hours into the night they worked to free the children, unlock the fetters, and carry them out one by one. And all the while, Greaves kept the book close. He didn't trust leaving it behind. The following day, Millfield was no longer quiet. News spread like a wildfire doused in kerosene. The Sullivan estate became the center of chaos. Swarms of townspeople, lawmen, and even clergy poured in. No one had seen Alistair or Marguerite Sullivan since Greaves broke into the house. The couple had vanished, their rooms ransacked, closets empty. Even their clothes were gone, as if they'd slipped into the mist and vanished with the dawn. The sheriff from neighboring Whitebridge arrived with reinforcements. A perimeter was set, horses were sent in all directions, but the Reverend and his wife had evaporated. More disturbing still, none of the children had any identification. Not one bore a full name. Many didn't even remember their real names. They had been down there so long, some thought the chains were normal. They whispered to each other about the masks, and the songs from the pit, and the woman in the blue veil. None of it made sense. Dr. Howard, the town physician, examined the children and gave a damning report. They had been underground for years, malnourished, scarred, diseased. Some bore old fractures that had healed incorrectly. Several were blind in one eye, one had no tongue. Yet what baffled him most was how they had survived at all. There were no food stores in the basement, no clean water, nothing to sustain them. And yet they lived. Greaves remained in town, now living, out of a rented room at Clara Hensley's home above the bakery. He kept the book locked in a chest with iron clasps, though sometimes he would sit beside it late at night, lantern burning low, staring at it as if it might whisper something to him. He hadn't opened it since the basement. Something about the way the children looked at it, how their fear grew when he even mentioned it, unsettled him. Still, curiosity gnawed at him like a rat in the walls. One night, when the wind screamed outside and thunder cracked over the hills, he gave in. He lit a candle, placed the book on the desk, and slowly opened its swollen cover. The pages inside were impossibly aged. Ink blurred in places, but the illustrations remained vivid. Anatomical drawings, only they weren't human. Creatures with too many eyes, limbs that bent in reverse, tongues that stretched around skulls. One page depicted a hollow man, his skin peeled back to reveal darkness instead of muscle. There were pages that seemed to be maps, Circles within circles, roads that looped back on themselves, stairways into pits labeled with runes. In the margins, newer handwriting had been added, almost certainly Alistair Sullivan's. The notes were fanatical. Their eyes show me things. The blood is the key, but it must be clean. Only the untouched can sing the right. She lives beneath. She feeds. We must not starve her again. One page was entirely black, save for a single white symbol in the center, an elongated triangle with hooks at the ends and an eye in the middle. As Greaves studied it, his candle sputtered. Then something scraped behind him. He turned sharply, pistol drawn, but the room was empty. The door was still locked. His heart pounded against his ribs. He closed the book, relocked the chest, and poured himself a glass of whiskey with trembling hands. That night, he dreamed of the basement again. But this time it wasn't abandoned. He saw Alistair standing among the chains, whispering to the children. His voice was low and rhythmic, like a hymn. Behind him loomed a dark doorway that hadn't been there before. It pulsed. From within came breathing, slow, wet. And then a woman stepped out, a towering figure cloaked in a blue veil, her face obscured but glowing faintly from within. Her presence froze the room, her footsteps bleeding shadows. The children knelt, chained, humming softly. She looked at Greaves through the dream and spoke without moving her mouth. "You opened the door!" He awoke screaming, soaked in sweat. The soul. Clock showed 3:33 a.m. He rose, washed his face, and tried to calm his nerves. But the dread lingered. When he opened his wardrobe for a fresh shirt, something fell from the shelf. It was a drawing, done in charcoal on thick paper. A child's hand. It showed a figure holding a lantern in one hand and a book in the other. Behind him was a staircase. Beneath him was a pit, and from the pit rose a face, sharp, smiling, crowned in thorns. At the bottom, in trembling script, it read, "You are next to Neil." Marshal Thomas Greaves hadn't known peace since the day he stepped foot inside the Sullivan house. Each night brought with it some new horror, shadowed dreams, whispers beneath the floorboards, and now, the drawings. He still wasn't sure how the charcoal sketch ended up in his wardrobe. None of the children had been inside the Hensley home. The bakery was locked tight every night. And yet the drawing was there, curled at the edges, etched in desperation. The woman with the thorned crown, the book in his hand, the pit. All of it felt like a warning, or worse, a prophecy. Despite the terror clawing at him, Greaves returned to the basement. He had to. The book, he hadn't opened it again, not yet. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay not just in the pages, but in the place where it had been found. There were still questions. Too many. The children remained under watchful care in the town infirmary, tended to by Dr. Howard and several local women. Most were silent, unresponsive, but a few had begun to speak in fragments. Strange fragments. Don't go where the singing starts. She eats what's forgotten. Only the chained can leave. Greaves didn't understand what they meant. On a clouded August morning, armed with his revolver, a lantern, and the key to the Sullivan house, which was now officially sealed under state order, he made the journey back to Black Hollow Road. The house stood still as a corpse. Boards flapped gently in the wind. The stench hadn't faded. Inside, nothing had moved since his last visit. The same armoire scraped back, the same basement door pried open. As he descended into the darkness again, a sickly chill pressed against him, Unnatural for the summer heat above, he counted each step down loud in his head. 17, 18, 19. At the bottom, silence greeted him like an old friend. The chains remained. So did the stains. But there was something else now. Something he hadn't noticed before. A door. It was almost hidden, camouflaged against the stone wall at the far back. He must have overlooked it in the chaos. It was narrow, wooden, and newer than the rest of the structure. A faint draft slipped through the cracks around it, and with it came music. No, not music. Singing, a soft, lilting hum. He held his lantern, close and approached. The humming continued, rhythmic and hollow, as though a child were singing alone in a vast chamber. His hand reached for the latch. It was cold. With a deep breath, he opened the door. The air behind it shifted like breath from a lung. The passage was narrower than expected. The stone gave way to carved earth, a tunnel descending further beneath the land, sloping gradually. The singing grew louder but no clearer. The voice, if it was a voice, remained genderless, ageless, devoid of words. As he moved, he noticed scratches along the walls, small gouges in the dirt, like tiny hands had dragged along it in the dark. Bones appeared too, small ones. Animal? Human? He couldn't tell. Every few feet, candles sat in cradles of clay. Long burned out, their wax melted to pools, yet they hinted at preparation. Ritual. He followed the path until it opened into a cavern. And there, Greaves found the source of the song. Dozens of children stood in a circle, their backs to him. Naked from the waist up, hair long and unkempt, skin smeared in soot or dried blood, they swayed as they hummed side to side in unison. Their chains clinked softly with each motion. In the center of the circle sat an altar made of stone, blackened with age, and above the altar floated something that could not be explained. It was like smoke and flesh entwined, formless and yet humanoid. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a veil of blue. A crown of thorns sat atop its head, just as in the drawing, and from its chest radiated a dull, pulsing glow. The children didn't see Greaves, or if they did, they didn't care. He stepped forward. One child turned. A boy no older than 10. His eyes were all pupil, black and endless. "You shouldn't have come here," he said calmly. "What is this place?" Greaves asked, voice trembling. The boy looked back at the entity, then said, "This is where she sings. We are the choir." Greaves stepped forward, gun drawn. "What is she?" The child did not answer. Instead, the creature's head turned. Though it had no visible mouth, it smiled, and in that moment, Greaves heard a sound. Not with his ears, but in his skull. A humming that vibrated through bone. Words not spoken, but implanted. "You heard the names. You opened the door. You brought me above." Greaves fell to one knee, clutching his head. Visions exploded behind his eyes, rituals conducted beneath the house, the Sullivans cloaked in robes, children placed in circles, the book read aloud under lunar eclipses, blood drawn with care, songs sung in reversed Latin, summoning through, innocence, and worse, something coming through, not the woman, no, something behind her, a thing with teeth of stone and wings of glass, eyes that devoured light. It lived deeper still, and she was its herald. Greaves forced himself up. He raised his gun and fired at the entity. The bullet passed through it harmlessly. The children stopped singing. Slowly, each turned to face him, faces blank, lips stitched, shut, not physically, but by some unseen force. They began to walk toward him, barefoot on the cold ground. He backed away, firing again. Still nothing. And then came the scream. Not from the children. From beneath the altar. A roar of agony and hunger so fierce it cracked one of the cavern walls. Greaves turned and ran, through the tunnel, up the stairs, past the chains, past the blood, and bones and memories. He burst from the basement, heart pounding, lungs seizing. Outside, the sky had darkened with storm clouds, but it was only noon. By the time he returned to town, the infirmary was in chaos. Children had begun speaking in tongues. Several had vanished. One boy was found seated in the chapel, drawing the symbol with his own blood on the pews. The local priest, Father Morrison, tried to exorcise him. The boy laughed in 3 voices. Greaves locked the book in the sheriff's safe. It was no longer safe in his presence. The town wanted answers. The governor sent word. A federal team was being assembled to investigate the Sullivan property. But Greaves knew it was too late. They had opened something. Not just a basement, a gate. And gates do not close themselves. 3 days after Marshal Thomas Greaves fled the depths of the Sullivan estate, the sky above Millfield remained locked in a haze. Sunlight barely filtered through the thick veil of gray, casting the town in a permanent state of twilight. The townsfolk murmured of omens. Livestock were stillborn, milk curdled before it could cool, and wells bubbled with foul-smelling sediment. Children still chained in memory wept through the nights, uttering nonsense verses in sing-song whispers. The priests burned incense in homes. Mothers carved crosses into the lintels of their doorways. No one dared speak of the singing that had resumed beneath the earth, except Greaves. He hadn't slept since the night of his return. Instead, he sat alone in the sheriff's office, next to the heavy iron safe that held the book, the artifact he now regretted ever removing from its altar. He scribbled notes feverishly into a journal, trying to connect dots that refused to align. The book, the children, the woman in the veil, the pit, the song, and now a new name whispered by the infirmary children like a prayer and a curse all at once. The man without eyes. No one could tell him what it meant, until the boy named Elias began to draw. Elias had not spoken a word since being freed from the basement. 10 years old, pale as ash, he had once been shackled closest to the altar. Now he sat in a locked room at the edge of the infirmary, scribbling non-stop on parchment with charcoal. Greaves was called when the pages began to. Form patterns, dozens of illustrations of the same man, faceless, tall, wrapped in black, hands with too many fingers. Where the eyes should have been, there were only hollow circles, bleeding darkness. One of the nurses, a brave woman named Miss June, claimed she had seen Elias wake in the middle of the night, stand barefoot by the window, and whisper into the empty air. "He's coming for the reader." Greaves felt the ice in those words settle in his bones. He returned to the sheriff's office and opened the journal again. Every page of his notes seemed to spiral back to one thing. The book was not simply a relic, it was a beacon. The markings, the rituals, even the altered children, all pointed to a larger intelligence behind the events. A presence that had been summoned, or perhaps released, and now something had been sent after the one who broke the chain. Him. That night, just after the clock struck midnight, Greaves heard something. At first it was only a tapping, soft, rhythmic, barely audible, at the window behind him. He turned sharply, hand on his revolver, but saw only glass stained with rain. The tapping stopped, then it resumed. But now, it was at the door. He rose. The office was empty. The deputies had gone home. The sheriff was in Whitebridge attending a regional council meeting. Greaves was alone, just as the thing wanted him. He crept toward the door and placed his ear against silence. He flung it open, revolver raised. Nothing, no footsteps. No wind. Just the thick scent of soil, wet, freshly turned earth. He stepped outside. The air was thick. Still. The town was asleep, or pretending to be. Fog curled between the buildings like fingers. In the distance, the church bell tolled once, though no hour had passed. Greaves returned inside, but the book was gone. The safe door was wide open. No signs of forced entry. No scratches, no bent hinges. It was as if the lock had simply obeyed. In the book's place, on the floor, was a single page, not paper, skin, and on it, burned into the flesh with acid or fire, was the same symbol from the basement, the triangle, the eye, the thorns. He fell to his knees. The book hadn't been stolen. It had been claimed. At sunrise, the first death was reported. Jacob Morton, the town's blacksmith, was found hanging upside down from the rafters of his barn, his eyes removed cleanly from their sockets, lips sewn shut with horsehair thread. A strange black powder was spread in a circle beneath him. The sheriff returned later that morning, and panic spread fast. By dusk, 2 more were dead. The widow from the bakery, Clara Hensley, and her apprentice. Their bodies had been arranged on the chapel steps, hands folded in prayer, tongues cut out and placed in their palms. A message had been painted on the door in blood. The choir will rise. Greaves stood over the bodies, jaw clenched, heart racing. This was not random. It was targeted, ritualistic, and it wasn't over. Inside the chapel, he found Father Morrison in tears. "I told you," the priest muttered. "We should have burned the house, salted the ground, sealed the gate." "You knew," Greaves said quietly. The priest nodded. "Not all of it," he admitted. "But enough. There were whispers years ago, back when Alistair first came here. He was no reverend. He was cast out of the seminary for unholy studies. They found him with forbidden texts. He spoke of a forgotten God, something older than Scripture." Greaves clenched his fists. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" "Because we were afraid," the priest confessed. "And maybe we believed it would stay buried." That night, Greaves didn't sleep. He loaded his revolver with silver rounds, purely symbolic, but it gave him something to believe in. Then, just before midnight, as he sat in the center of his room with candles on all sides, he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, measured. Inside the house, he rose slowly, heart pounding. The candles flickered. Shadows lengthened. He turned toward the hallway and saw him, the man without eyes, tall, towering, faceless, wrapped in a cloak of shadows and black linen, arms too long, hands dangling at his sides with fingers that twitched. Like spider legs, his face was smooth skin, pale and featureless, no mouth, no nose, no eyes, and yet Greaves felt him see, a presence pushed into his mind, like cold nails driving into his thoughts. "You read, you trespassed, now you kneel." Greaves raised his gun and fired. The bullet passed through air. The man without eyes moved forward, silent, unhurried. Greaves ran, through the hallway, down the stairs, into the street. The town was dead still. No lights in windows, no voices. Fog coiled around his ankles like chains. Behind him, no footsteps. But the feeling remained, like breath on his neck. He stumbled into the church and slammed the door shut behind him. Father Morrison was there, still praying. Greaves dropped to his knees. "He's here." The priest nodded, pale and hollow-eyed. He never left. He was part of the price, the guardian of the threshold. He comes when the door opens, when the song begins anew. They sat in silence as the chapel groaned. Outside, the fog whispered. Within the darkness came a hum, faint, growing. The choir was waking. The morning after Greaves fled into the chapel, the town of Millfield found itself altered in ways subtle and severe. It wasn't just that more livestock had been found mutilated in rings of ash, or that the church bell now rang once every hour despite no one pulling the rope. It was the atmosphere itself, thicker, charged, like the town existed in the eye of an invisible storm. Father Morrison called it the thinning, when the veil between worlds stretches thin enough for things to pass through. He claimed it had happened once before, long ago, during the earliest days of Millfield's founding. Back then, people had gone mad in clusters, crops had withered in hours, and a girl had been found walking backward through town with her mouth sewn shut and a voice that wasn't hers whispering beneath the stitches. Greaves had no interest in legends. He wanted solutions, but he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The man without eyes, the vanishing of the book, the eerie synchronization of the children, once chained, now eerily compliant, speaking in verses and visions, and always, behind every corner of the mind, the humming, the song that never truly stopped. Father Morrison and Greaves sat in the chapel, surrounded by candles and old scripture. "We have to return to the altar," Morrison whispered, "to the source. You saw what's waking. If the choir fully rises, there will be no veil left. Only him." Greaves stared at him. "The man without eyes?" The priest shook his head slowly. "No. He's only the sentinel, a gatekeeper. What lies beyond is the reason the Sullivans began this madness to begin with. Something ancient. Pre-language. Pre-human. They called it Emelach, the forgotten god." Greaves remembered the name scrawled in Sullivan's handwriting in the book. He who feasts beneath. He also remembered what the children had said, "Only the chained can leave." "I'm going back," Greaves said, jaw tight. "With or without you." They rode out before dusk with 2 horses and packs full of oil, salt, a lantern, and rope. Greaves had strapped vials of holy water around his chest, although he wasn't sure they would help. He carried both his revolver and a rusted saber from the sheriff's collection. Morrison brought only a Bible and a wooden crucifix he had carved himself. The Sullivan house stood like a sentinel, its skeletal remains sagging in the twilight. As they crossed the threshold, a wind stirred through the interior, carrying with it the sickly sweet scent of rotting herbs and something deeper. Burnt hair, perhaps, or scorched bone. They descended the stairs into the basement once again. The air had changed. It was colder, yet thicker. Breathing became a conscious effort. The once empty chains now hung tighter against the walls, as though trying to shrink away from what lurked beyond the door at the back. That door was open, as if waiting. Greaves paused at the threshold of the tunnel beyond. "You don't have to come," he said without turning. I never left, Morrison replied. They moved silently down the earthen corridor, the walls breathing with unseen veins. The humming began again as they descended, faint, melodic, mournful. When they reached the cavern, it was no longer the same. The altar remained at the center, yes, but it had changed. It now pulsed with a heartbeat of its own, radiating faint light like a wound in the earth. Symbols swam across its surface, flickering between languages, and around the altar stood the children, all 47. No chains, no expressions. Their eyes were open, wide, dark as pitch. Their mouths moved in silent unity, singing a song Greaves could not hear with ears but felt in every molecule of his body, a wall of vibration. Greaves stepped forward. "We're here to end this." The children didn't move. They continued their hymn. Then a voice, neither child nor adult, rose above the hum. Feminine, melodic, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "You are late." From behind the altar stepped Marguerite Sullivan. She wore the same blue veil from Greaves's visions, now tattered and burned at the hem. Her feet were bare, caked in mud. Her hands bled from the fingertips, leaving trails of red behind her. "Alistair gave his soul to the pit," she said, her voice calm and dreamlike. "But I remained as the vessel, as the mouthpiece." Morrison gripped his crucifix tighter. "You summoned Emelach, why?" "Because he remembers us," she said. "When the old gods were cast down, only he remained beneath, patient and hungry. He gives gifts to those who sing." Greaves stepped closer. "And what gift did he give you?" She smiled beneath the veil. "He gave me silence. And now, he will give me more." The altar split with a groan. From its center rose a column of ash and bone, and from it, a shape. At first it resembled a man, then a beast, then neither. It twisted in on itself, shifting with each blink. Its surface was made of eyes, each one blinking out of sync. A mouth yawned open vertically across its chest, lined with teeth like splinters. Greaves froze. The thing didn't step. It glided, trailing smoke, and behind it, standing in the darkness like a warden of reality itself, was the man without eyes. Greaves screamed and fired, once, twice, 5 times. Each round hit the beast and passed through it like dust. Morrison began to pray, voice quivering. "In the name of the Father, the Son." Marguerite raised her arms. The children collapsed in unison, their song becoming a drone. The creature opened its mouth and spoke not in words, but meanings, raw, invasive, made of grief and birth and screaming voids. Greaves fell to one knee, blood running from his nose. "You opened me. You fed me. Now I feed." Greaves crawled toward the altar, his mind fractured. Memories swam in reverse, his childhood, the war, faces he'd forgotten clawed back into his skull. He reached for the salt pouch and flung it at the creature, a ripple, not pain, but a momentary distortion. Morrison cried out, splashing the floor with holy water. The beast recoiled, not from pain, but annoyance. Marguerite screamed. Her voice echoed with thousands. The man without eyes stepped forward, and Greaves knew they couldn't kill it, but maybe, just maybe, they could close the gate. He lunged for the altar, grabbed the stone slab, and tipped it. The room howled. The Yi Song snapped. The children shrieked in voices that weren't theirs. The ash column collapsed inward, and with it, the beast shriveled. It didn't die. It folded, sucked into itself like breath through a broken reed. Marguerite convulsed, veil falling away to reveal nothing. No face, just raw flesh, and the suggestion of eyes that had never opened. The man without eyes vanished in a blink, and suddenly, silence. The cave dimmed. The altar cracked. The children lay unconscious, and Greaves, bloodied and breathless, looked to Morrison. "Did we end it?" Morrison clutched his crucifix, barely breathing. For now, for a brief, precious moment, it seemed over. The children were alive. The altar was broken. Marguerite Sullivan had vanished into an ash pile. And the entity known as Emelach, the forgotten god, had been pulled back into the void, the gate, sealed through a storm of salt, scripture, and desperate instinct. But beneath the quiet, beneath the stillness in the aftermath, something remained. The whispering. It began softly, so subtle Greaves thought it was his own breath. While tending to the children who'd collapsed near the altar, he noticed it. A faint sound coming not from any mouth or corner, but from the walls themselves. Like stone remembering a name, like wind curling around the syllables of a prayer. No one should ever say aloud. Father Morrison heard it too. They said nothing at first, afraid to name it, afraid that doing so might stir it again. They carried the unconscious children up through the tunnel, through the broken basement, and into the late morning light. The horses were gone, bolted from the stables, spooked by what they'd felt rising from below. Greaves and Morrison walked the children back to Millfield one by one, each trip more exhausting than the last. It took nearly a full day. The sky stayed a cold, sour gray. By nightfall, the children were in cots at the town infirmary. Not one had opened their eyes. They breathed, hearts beating steady, but there was no recognition. They existed in a twilight state, unblinking, unmoving, except for one, Elias, the boy who had drawn the man without eyes, the boy who whispered riddles into the corners of rooms, the boy closest to the altar. He sat upright at midnight, and he spoke 3 words. It wasn't him. Greaves sat beside the boy's bed, sleep-deprived, nerves frayed, his revolver now holstered with no faith in its use. "What do you mean?" he asked. Elias turned toward him, eyes milky and unfocused. It wasn't the real God, it was a shadow, a voice wearing a name. Greaves frowned. "Emelach?" Elias nodded slowly. "He is still beneath." The words struck deep. Greaves had seen that thing, felt it inside his mind. If that wasn't the true Emelach, then whatever was still sleeping below was something far, far worse. "Then what was the thing we saw?" he asked. "A mouth," Elias whispered. "Only a mouth." Father Morrison and Greaves pored over the recovered scraps of the Sullivan Journal. Pages had been torn from the original book, presumably by Alistair himself, and hidden in false panels, behind the fireplace. A deputy had found them while searching the house for any lingering children. The pages were fragmented but hauntingly coherent. "You don't summon Emelach. You awaken him. The song is only the key. The choir only a signal flare. You must feed the mouth to make the eye open." Greaves looked up. "The eye?" Morrison traced his finger across one diagram, a crude sketch of a spiral staircase descending into a pit, at the bottom of which was drawn an enormous eye, slit-pupiled, wrapped in barbed lines. In many ancient beliefs, he said, the eye represents the birth of understanding. In this case, perhaps it represents the opposite, the unknowing. What happens if it opens? Greaves asked. Morrison didn't answer. He just closed the journal and stared at the candle on the table. The next day, the town changed again. The walls began whispering, literally. Every brick building in Millfield, schoolhouse, chapel, jail, bakery, began, emitting faint rhythmic murmurs, most noticeable just before sunset or at the stroke of 3:33 a.m. Several townspeople went mad. One woman flung herself into the well, claiming that her name had been erased. A man tore off his own ears, screaming that the song had returned to the stones. Dr. Howard, now in charge of the infirmary, reported that the children were deteriorating. Not physically, but mentally. Their speech was becoming more unified, synchronized, and worse still. Predictive. They're finishing each other's sentences, he told Greaves. Sometimes they speak in unison, in a language I've never heard. I've started writing it down. He handed over a sheet. The symbols were curved and jagged, unnatural, but familiar. Greaves had seen them before, in the walls of the cavern, in the margins of the book, in the dreams. He couldn't read them, not yet, but he could feel them. That night, Greaves returned to the Sullivan house alone. Morrison tried to stop him, begged him to wait for reinforcements, some cavalry from Richmond, a group of scholars, clergy, anyone. But Greaves knew time was irrelevant now. Things were moving beneath the surface, crawling in the cracks of reality, spreading like mold through consciousness. He had to act. He carried a lantern, a pack filled with dynamite from the quarry, and a Bible. As he entered the basement, he noticed it immediately. The walls had changed. No longer cracked stone. No longer brick. Now, flesh. Pale. Veined. Breathing. It pulsed softly with each step he took. He made his way to the altar cavern, where once stood stone, now stood a cathedral of sinew and bone, risen from the earth itself. The children were gone. The altar gone. The tunnel behind him gone. He was inside something now. Something alive. The walls murmured in familiar voices. His father's, his childhood teachers, men who died in the war. He pushed forward until he reached the center of the chamber. There, sunk into the floor, was a well, but instead of water, it reflected stars. Black sky, unfathomable depth, and in the center, blinking slowly, was the eye, the real one. It saw him, and the world around him spoke, not with one voice, with millions. The chain is memory, you remember. You bind us. Unlearn, forget, let go. We are the walls, we are the names. Greaves dropped to his knees, mind buckling. He pulled the sticks of dynamite from his pack with trembling hands. If he couldn't kill the god, he could bury it, forever. He rigged the fuses, lit them with a match, and whispered a prayer. Not for himself, for the children. The blast was heard, across the county. Fire shot from the ground near Black Hollow Road like a geyser. The land collapsed inward, the Sullivan house swallowed in seconds. No one found Greaves's body, but in the ruins they found a page, charred, stained with blood. Written in Greaves' hand, it read, "The eye sleeps again, but it sleeps in us now." Millfield changed after the explosion. The earth where the Sullivan house had once stood became a scorched crater, filled with ash and soot. The dynamite had torn through rock, bone, and time itself. But it had not destroyed the eye. Not completely. Not forever. What Greaves had done, whether by accident or divine intuition, wasn't obliteration. It was interruption. A pause. A breath caught in the throat of something ancient. And Millfield was still breathing with it. The first thing people noticed were the windows. They began to darken. Not with grime or soot, but with something that moved, slowly, like fog behind the glass. By the second morning after the collapse, nearly every pane of glass in town had become opaque. You could no longer see through them. Not from the outside, not from the inside. Even when broken and replaced, the new panes fogged over within hours. At first, people joked nervously. They chalked it up to bad air or spiritual residue. The local preacher, Reverend Kane, declared it a test from the Almighty. But by the fourth day, no one was laughing. Not even him. Because the windows started watching back. Mrs. Emery, widow who lived on the southern edge of town, was the first to claim it. Her parlor window had gone cloudy like the rest. But one morning she rose and saw, through the murk, a silhouette. It looked like a boy, maybe 10, pale, wide-eyed, standing, motionless behind the glass, inside the house, though she'd been alone. She blinked. It vanished. She laughed it off, until it happened again the next morning, and then a third. By the end of the week, every home in Millfield had a story. Windows weren't just dark. They were watching. The children in the infirmary, now under constant supervision, had stopped speaking altogether. Even Elias, Dr. Howard, increasingly haggard and short-tempered, recorded that they were entering the mimic phase. When asked to explain, he simply gestured at one of the girls, Annabelle, age 7. He asked her, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she mirrored his own words back to him with the same tone and cadence. "Who are you?" he asked. Again. She responded again, the exact same way. It was like listening to a parrot. Only her eyes stayed fixed on him the whole time, unblinking, unmoving. Howard reported this behavior spreading to all 46 children. "They're not answering us," he wrote. "They're learning us, rehearsing us." That night, the town council convened an emergency meeting at the Millfield Chapel, one of the only buildings left untouched by the fog glass. The mayor, Samuel Avery, demanded a full quarantine of the infirmary. Whatever Greaves brought back up with him, it's in their heads now. Maybe in ours, too. Others were skeptical. The town blacksmith, Orville Hatch, stood and slammed his palm on the pew. "I've seen demons, men. I've seen war and blood. This ain't that. This is like a dream. But it doesn't end when I wake up. I see them in my sleep, all of them children, and when I look into my mirror—" He trailed off. "What happens when you look?" asked Reverend Kane. Orville's jaw clenched. "I don't see me anymore." Outside the chapel, the wind had stopped entirely. Millfield had no wind, no bird song, and no moon for 3 nights straight. And then the second change came. Not in the windows, but in the people. It began with Rebecca Childs, a midwife and beloved figure in the community. She vanished one morning, simply not in her home, not in the town square, not at her post. They searched. And when they finally pried open her cellar, boards nailed shut from the inside, they found her sitting in a chair, hands folded neatly, her mouth sewn shut with coarse black thread. Her eyes were wide open. Her throat hummed a single tone, the same tone the children had been humming the day before. Others began to disappear over the following week. 8 more by the count of the mayor's ledger. Each time, a similar discovery. A locked room, a silent, and something resembling worship. But to what? No one could say. Father Morrison had returned to the church archives in desperation. He turned to old heretical texts, letters from early settlers, even tribal oral histories left by the Monacan people who once occupied the region. One entry, recorded by a Jesuit priest in 1697, stood out. The people of the fog spoke of a time before language, when the world was flat and the ground was flesh. They feared the He that knows us, whose eye sees backward. When the children sang, the knowing began again. The He that knows us. Morrison underlined the phrase, trembling. Amalek may not have been a god in the traditional sense, not a deity, to worship, but rather a consciousness that unlearned you. To be seen by it wasn't to be blessed, it was to be unwritten. In a last act of desperation, the mayor proposed the unthinkable: evacuate Millfield. Burn it behind us. Most agreed, terrified, exhausted, desperate for escape. But it was too late. The roads were gone, literally, like sand swept clean. Maps made no sense. Compasses spun. Landmarks vanished overnight. One family, the Delacours, had set out westward at dawn. By noon, they returned, without having turned around, without having walked in a circle. The woods were different now, too quiet, too symmetrical, like they were being grown from memory, someone else's memory. By the 14th day, the final change began. Mirrors no longer reflected reality. In some homes, people looked into mirrors and saw themselves aged, injured, or missing limbs. In others, the reflections didn't move at all, even when the person did. And in a few cases, the mirror simply showed the basement of the Sullivan house. Not as it was, as it still was. Elias, the last child to retain any speech, uttered one final phrase before falling into complete silence: "You are not the dreamer anymore." On the night of the full moon, which did not rise but instead sank into the ground, a tremor ran through Millfield. The whispering ceased, the windows cleared, but no one dared look through them. And in the morning, the town square was empty, not abandoned, erased, benches gone, fountains gone. Cobblestones replaced by soft gray dirt. Only the church remained, and in its bell tower, written in black chalk, "He sees now." Father Morrison, alone in the chapel, wrote one final entry in his Bible margins. "We fought a God with dynamite and prayer, and all we did was give him names. This town is the book now, and we're just letters being rewritten. There was no clock, no sun, no wind." Millfield had become a place outside time. The town existed now in a slow drift, like the space between breaths. It had a morning that never truly dawned, and a night that never really fell. A suspended moment, as if the world was waiting for something or someone to finish writing the last sentence of a terrible story. And yet, within this hush, one sound still remained. Footsteps. They echoed across the stone floor of the church where Father Morrison sat, no longer reading, no longer praying, just staring at the wall where someone, or something, had written, "He sees now." The footsteps didn't come from behind him. They came from beneath. Dr. Nathaniel Howard, now days unwashed and muttering to himself, stood alone in the infirmary. Or rather, what was left of it. Most of the beds were overturned, the floorboards scorched, and the ceiling bowed inward like the building had exhaled its soul. The children were still there, all 47, sitting perfectly upright on the stone floor, backs straight, hands folded, eyes open and unblinking. They did not speak. They did not breathe, not as he understood it. Their bodies remained warm, but they did not move, except for the 47th child. She was new. No one remembered admitting her. No record of birth, name, or origin. She simply appeared. Among the others one morning, sitting at the back of the infirmary, humming the same single tone. She had auburn hair matted with dust, a stitched collar that read D, and her eyes were the color of ash and bruised sky. Howard had thought it a hallucination, sleep deprivation, madness. But each day she returned, and with her presence the children's expressions changed. They smiled, not with joy, but with something older, something that understood what Millfield had become. On the 6th night after her arrival, Dr. Howard made a decision. He gathered his journal, the key to the Sullivan cellar, still intact though buried beneath rubble, and a single lantern. Whatever had begun under that house hadn't ended. Not really. The fog, the mimicry, the windows, the dreams, everything pointed to a central origin, a single rotted tooth in the jaw of the town, and he would pull it out. Alone. The crater where the Sullivan house once stood was now a sinkhole, its edges jagged and sharp like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The wind had begun to return, but it came from below, carrying a scent like copper, mildew, and old parchment. Howard descended slowly, lantern raised, the rope creaking behind him. And as his feet touched the soil of the old basement, he found stairs, not new, revealed. Stairs of smooth stone spiraling downward, impossibly far. He descended, and the walls began to whisper. At first it was like wind through reeds, but as he listened more closely, he realized the whispers were names, children's names, spoken backward. Each name he heard he remembered from the registry. Every child, every orphan taken in by the Sullivans, had a name spoken here. And then the voices paused. One last name echoed through the stairwell, spoken with reverence. Daly. Howard froze. That wasn't on the list, not one of the 46, not even the 47th girl. No, this was the original, the first name, Daly. A child no one remembered. Child with no origin, a child that perhaps wasn't a child at all. The spiral stairs ended in a chamber unlike anything Howard had ever seen. No masonry, no wood. Just a smooth, circular room carved entirely from bone-white stone, lit by an ambient glow that seemed to bleed from the walls themselves. At the center was a mirror, but not one that reflected. It absorbed. It was liquid and smoke and shimmer, and in it he saw not his face, but his thoughts, his memories, his fears, his childhood scraped knees, his father's belt, his mother's silent prayers, his time in war, his return, his guilt, his sins. One by one his memories were fed to the mirror, and it began to form a shape, a child, no older than 10, but its face was his own. Back in town, the final transformation was underway. The church bells rang, though no one had pulled them. The by-streets filled with children, dozens of them, all barefoot, all silent. Some were recognizable, some were not. Some had faces that flickered like firelight, changing from moment to moment. Reverend Cain, now nearly blind, stood at the pulpit and read from a book that no one had seen before. It had no title. Its pages were filled with names, millions of them, written in a language without letters. And as he read, one word echoed through the sky: return. Down below, Howard began to scream. The child in the mirror was no longer still. It was moving, tilting its head, smiling. Its eyes bled ink that dripped into the stone floor and bloomed like roots. It opened its mouth and said, "There was never a 47th child. There was only one. The rest were pages. And you were the quill." The mirror shattered without sound, and from it rose the girl with the stitched collar. Only now, Howard recognized her fully. She was not an orphan, not a victim. She was the book itself, the story made flesh. Every child the Sullivans had taken, every life, had been written inside her. And now, she was full. The final moment came like a closing eye. Howard opened his mouth to scream, but found himself voiceless. The ink from the mirror ran up his legs, arms, spine, and then he was no longer there. In Millfield, the people fell asleep all at once, not from exhaustion, but as if someone had closed the book mid-sentence. Time stopped, the air shimmered, and then a single bell rang. Once, when the federal marshals arrived, weeks later they found only ruins. No people, no bodies, just a town that seemed to have collapsed inward. Buildings half sunk into the ground, roads unfinished, trees turned toward the center. And at the very heart of town stood the church. Inside there were no pews, just a single chair, and on it a girl with auburn hair and a stitched collar marked D. She smiled, opened her mouth, and whispered the last name in the book: yours.